Hey, happy Monday, everybody. Doing some show prep for this evening's program, and I ran across a story that's in the Hill about a Democrat campaign of disinformation in the special Senate election in Alabama last year. You may recall that the Republican candidate was, I call him a goober, but his name was Roy Moore. He was what you might call, well, I think he was kind of a nut job. And I'm not sure he could have won the race anyway. But what the Hill's reporting today is that Democrats in Alabama created a disinformation campaign that they used on both Facebook and Twitter, spent some $100,000 on each of those platforms to spread false information about Roy Moore. And the false information, according to the report, was that he was opposed to uh, alcohol. Let me find just exactly what it says. The campaign was called Dry Campaign, and the idea was to try to convince everybody that Roy Moore was some sort of, you know, prohibitionist against alcohol, that he wanted to, make alcohol illegal. And they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this disinformation campaign on both Twitter and on Facebook. So, what are we to learn from this? Everybody keeps talking, including me, keeps talking about how Facebook and Twitter, are censoring conservatives, or they've got these special safety committees that are going to decide what should be on the platforms and not be on the platforms. And of course, I keep hearing from everybody that what we ought to do is that we ought to somehow regulate what goes on Facebook and Twitter, which I'm opposed to because, again, those are private companies. They're publicly traded companies, but they're private companies in the context of the First Amendment. By that I mean, even though they have shareholders and even though they are publicly traded, in terms or the context of the First Amendment, they are private companies. So they're not subject to the strictures of the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall, prohibit any infringement against free speech. And by virtue of the 14th Amendment, that applies to state and local governments, special districts, and, well, virtually any government entity. So, what are we to make of this? Well, first, I think we ought to learn that the safety committees, the censorship committees, whatever committees that Facebook and Twitter have put together to make sure that there's no conservative thought, or there's no illegal activity, or, God forbid, that there's something that they disagree with that appears on their platforms, we ought to forget about that. And what we really ought to do is understand a couple of things. First, and some of you may take offense to this, but, well, you mistake me for somebody that cares because you know that I speak my mind about things regularly. If you're getting your news from Facebook and Twitter, you ought to re examine where you're getting your news. Now, people have asked me before, well, Michael, where do you get your news? Well, I'm in a unique position in that I get to spend most of my day really researching all the different places. I start out reading the Drudge Report, I read the Wall Street Journal, I read the New York Times, the Washington Post. Occasionally, I'll go through the Denver Post. I read CompleteColorado.com. That ought to be in your bookmarks. But there's probably, I don't know, I would say there's 40 or 50 go to websites that I look at every day. But even when I look at some of those websites, both conservative and liberal, even then, I read what I read on those websites with a jaundiced eye. Because I know the conservative websites sometimes are going to get things wrong, just as the liberal websites are. But what we really ought to understand is that you have to look at numerous out, outlets in order to get a honest viewpoint of what's going on. You don't have to just read the news sources too. Let me use the Wall Street Journal for an example. I've been an avid reader of the Wall Street Journal for, gosh, probably 30 years or more. I'll tell you two things about the Wall Street Journal. First and foremost, the editorial page is worth a subscription. Just reading the editorial page is worth, whether you can get a discount subscription, you pay the full amount every year, you can get a student subscription, whatever you can do, I would do it just for the editorial page. But then I would say this about the Wall Street Journal reporting. Yes, it tends to have a left of center bent. But one thing the Wall Street Journal does, which unfortunately I don't think the Washington Post does a very good job of, certainly the New York Times doesn't, and the Denver Post doesn't either. But I'm going to set aside the Denver Post for a second and explain to you another problem the Denver Post has separate and apart from fact checking. So the Wall Street Journal is probably better at fact checking than most of the others. So I would say the Wall Street Journal is a good baseline to start. And from there, you can read things like Breitbart, you can read the Daily Caller, you can read the Daily Caller News Foundation. There are all sorts of conservative websites that you can read to get the opinions, in addition to the news, because, for example, the Daily Caller and Breitbart also have news sections. But if you learn to distinguish between what's reported as the news and then read opinions about what's being reported in the news, you put those two things together and you can start to discern what's factual, what's not factual, or perhaps what is being reported with a certain perspective, a certain political bent, versus just true journalism. Just, these are the facts, we just give you the facts as they are, and we let you make the decision about what to interpret from those facts. Very few places do that anymore. That means that for all of us, getting news, getting journalism, getting the facts about what is going on is probably more challenging than it has ever been before. And I think that's a lot of the reason why people rely on Facebook and Twitter. I still look at Facebook, but I look at Facebook more so because I'm fascinated more about what friends, people that follow the program, people that listen to the show. I'm more interested about what you are posting, because oftentimes what I see people posting, I know intuitively is a hoax. Or I know intuitively that what I read in today's news sites doesn't really jive with what everybody's posting. So that kind of gives me a way to figure out what everybody's talking about, but also allows me to then figure out whether it's truthful or not. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use Facebook. I'm not saying you shouldn't use Twitter. I'm just saying this. If you use Facebook and Twitter to get your news, and that's your sole source, even if you're relying upon somebody else that's posted a story, you still need to read that story yourself before you decide to post it, because that's exactly what took place in Alabama. So the Democrats start this disinformation campaign, Dry Alabama. And what they do is they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars placing ads and stories on Facebook and Twitter that are utterly, utterly false. But people who rely on Facebook and Twitter for their news look at that and say, oh, it must be true. And then it gets shared and shared and shared and shared. So I'm not trying to shut down Facebook and Twitter. I'm not trying to get government regulation. I'm not trying to get anybody to censor Facebook and Twitter. I think they can do whatever they want to do. What I'm trying to do is to get everybody else, as best I can with my little platform, to use other sources to get your news. You know, we joke on air. Many of you have joked with me. Well, if it's on the interwebs, it must be true. I could say exactly the same thing about Facebook and Twitter. If you say, well, I read it on Facebook, so it must be true, that's the same thing as saying, well, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. I know this is hard because most people are, Facebook and Twitter, boom, it's just right there. It's like a slot machine. The stories just pass by you constantly. You read the headlines, something catches your attention, so you click on it and you read it, and then you go on to the next story. It truly is the slot machine of news. So I know that it's difficult. You're eating breakfast in the morning, you're getting ready to go to work, and so you sit down and you start reading Facebook, you start going through your Twitter feed or whatever else you might do, and that's an easy way to consume news. I think that's a very bad way to consume news too. So there's a report out, for example, our company did a study that is reported in the news today, that radio is one of the most trusted, if not the most trusted source of news. that people trust radio more than they do anything else. So what I do when I do my program, I tell you one, and you know this from listening to me over the years, I come from a right of center perspective. So when I talk about stories, even though I try to give you the factual background of the story, I then try to give you my perspective about that story, which comes from a right of center perspective. I say all of that to get to this point. Consuming news in this day and age is incredibly difficult because we're bombarded with information. We are constantly being bombarded from all different places with information. And so it's just easy. Well, my friend, Billy Bob posted that, so it must be true. Well, Billy Bob probably got it from Sally Jane, and Sally Jane got it from her friend. And the next thing you know, it's been spread like wildfire across all of these platforms. And then we don't take the time to sit down and really study, is that true or not true? It's what I call being a discerning consumer of news. You've heard me use that phrase a bazillion times on the radio. So I bring you this story about Democrats trying to defeat Roy Moore in Alabama by using fake online campaign stories. I'll talk about it again tonight briefly, but I want you to think about this. However you get your news, maybe you ought to just spend a day really watching what you consume. It's so easy to you're rushing out to get ready to go to work, or you're sitting at your computer during the day. You got to take care of the kids. You've got to do all of these things. And so Facebook and Twitter become an easy place to get the news. Just like sitting down and watching a 30-minute newscast on television, watching the networks, and in 30 minutes you get 18 to 20 minutes of actual news and the rest is commercials. Even they do the same thing. How in 2 minutes, in a 2-minute story, can you really get the facts about what's going on? So I would encourage everybody to just sit down and take an inventory of where and how you consume news, and then start trying to figure out ways, and maybe I'll even post a list sometime of those 50 different websites that you can, places you can use. And I freely admit, I read the New York Times. I hate the New York Times, but I read it because I want to see what they're saying. And in this case, the New York Times is the one that actually reported this story. That leads me back to the Denver Post. I don't subscribe to the Denver Post. I don't pay to get behind the paywall. And I don't do it for I don't do it for one main reason. And the main reason is this. The Denver Post relies primarily on the Associated Press and other wire services for their stories, with very little local reporting. If I truly want local reporting, I'll read the Colorado Springs Gazette, for example, which you can again find on CompleteColorado.com. Again, a great aggregator for Colorado news. So the Denver Post is like a lot of small, and I know Denver's not small, but small newspapers as compared to, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times. They rely on other stories. So the New York Times piece might or might not appear in the Denver Post. The Associated Press puts out a story. That gets fed out to hundreds, if not thousands, of newspapers across the country. I don't know how many are left anymore. And they all, almost verbatim, take that wire story and print it. So if you take a local newspaper, it might be good for, crime stories. It might be good for local stories about culture or other things. But in terms of really understanding big news items, you're probably not going to get that from the local newspaper. So Democrats tried to defeat Roy Moore. They use a disinformation campaign modeled on what the Russians ostensibly did in 2016. And it's a great example of how if you rely on these platforms that we all keep bitching and moaning about, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all the rest of them, then I think it's time for all of us to take an inventory of where we get our news, how we consume that news, and what are we doing to make certain that we get different viewpoints so that we can understand that, okay, there's this viewpoint, and this viewpoint, and from all those different viewpoints, I can glean 4 or 5 facts that help me understand why people have these different viewpoints. So join me on the radio program tonight. I'll talk about this story a little bit more in depth, But again, bottom line is this: take an inventory of how you consume your news and think about if you're really getting your news from good sources. Talk to you tonight.